today, we're going to be taking a look at a sermon called Widows.
Okay.
And this is from the Temple's Table series. Have you ever heard of this series?
The name rings a bell, but I don't think I've actually listened to any of them.
It's pretty fascinating stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And going into this one, I have to say, I didn't really expect to find, such a deep dive into, well, I guess the lives and the position in society of widows in biblical times.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. Like, it's really kind of amazing how much information is packed into this one sermon.
I'm intrigued. What kind of insights did you find most striking?
Well, one of the things that really stood out to me was how the sermon kind of places widows among I guess, the most vulnerable groups in society.
Okay.
It wasn't just widows. It was also orphans, foreigners, and the poor.
Right.
All of them needing specific care and attention.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's a recurring theme throughout the Bible, the need to care for those who are marginalized.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's that verse from James 1:27, religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world.
Oh, that's a powerful one. It really emphasizes the importance placed on caring for widows as a core expression of faith.
Yeah. It's almost like a litmus test.
Mm.
Your actions towards those who are most vulnerable kind of reveal the true nature of your faith.
I like that analogy. It really cuts to the heart of what it means to live out your beliefs.
Yeah. And it makes me curious, though, why this emphasis on widows is so significant theologically.
Yeah.
What does it say about God's character? What does it imply for us as believers today?
That's a great question. It gets to the core of the concept of God as a defender of the weak and the marginalized.
Right.
Especially in the Old Testament, you see this idea repeated over and over again, God as a protector, as a provider for those who have lost their traditional protectors, I guess.
Oh, yeah. Like in Psalm 68.5, a father to the fatherless, a defender of widows is God in his holy dwelling.
Right. And then you have Jeremiah 49.11, where God speaks directly to widows and says, leave your fatherless children, I will keep them alive. Your widows, too, can depend on me.
Yeah. Those verses are so powerful. It's like God is stepping in to fill that void, taking on the role of protector.
Exactly. And those verses offer comfort and security to widows, but they also set a precedent for how God's people are expected to act.
Yeah.
It's not just about God's personal relationship with widows. It's a model for us. It shows us how we should treat them, too.
So it's this beautiful image of God as a defender of widows, but then how does that translate into our own actions? Because the sermon I found interesting kind of moves from these broad concepts to very specific instructions.
Oh, interesting.
About how to care for widows, like in practical ways.
Okay, yeah.
Like in Deuteronomy 24.19, it talks about leaving the leftover harvest for widows to gather.
Right. So they have a way to provide for themselves. It's woven into the fabric of daily life, like agricultural practice even.
It shows how caring for widows was supposed to be, ingrained, just part of like normal life.
Right. Absolutely.
But then you see what can happen if people don't do this. You see the consequences. Like there's a really stark warning in Deuteronomy 27.1. It talks about a curse, like a literal curse on those who withhold justice from widows.
Wow. There's a real sense of moral obligation there. Like even, I guess, divine judgment is involved in how we treat the vulnerable.
It's serious business.
Yeah, it is. And it gets even stronger in the New Testament.
Oh, yeah.
Like in Mark 12.4, it says, they devour widows' houses and for a show make lengthy prayers. These men will be punished most severely.
Oh, wow. That's pretty intense.
Yeah, there's no mincing words there. It's a scathing indictment of hypocrisy, People who make a big show of being religious but then exploit those who are supposed to be helping. It's all about actions speaking louder than words. Aligning your actions with justice, with compassion, especially towards the most vulnerable.
Okay, so we've talked about, this idea of God as a defender of widows. We've talked about these practical instructions. But then the sermon introduces this other concept. It talks about the widow of honor.
Oh, okay.
And this is specifically mentioned in 1 Timothy 5.9-10.
Okay. What does it say about that?
Well, it outlines like specific qualities for a widow to be considered worthy of, like support.
Interesting.
It says she has to be over 60, faithful to her husband, and known for good deeds.
Okay. So not just any widow, but one who embodies certain virtues.
Right, and it even lists some of those good deeds.
Yeah.
Raising children, showing hospitality, helping those in need. It's like a picture of a woman who's respected for her contributions.
That gives us a really interesting glimpse into the social dynamics of, I guess, like the early Christian community, the expectations they had, the respect that was afforded to certain widows within that society.
Yeah. But wouldn't that create a system where, some widows are deemed more worthy of support than others?
Mm, that's a good point.
How does that reconcile with this broader message of universal compassion?
That's a really important question. It raises some complex issues about social hierarchies and I guess, the potential for exclusion within religious communities,
Right.
even those built on ideals of like compassion and care.
It's complicated. It definitely makes you think,
It does.
you know. Even systems designed to help can sometimes lead to these, well, unintended consequences or, even reinforce inequalities.
Yeah, that's the challenge, isn't it? Trying to create systems that are truly just and equitable that don't inadvertently leave some people behind is something we always need to be mindful of, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And it shows how important it is to approach, these texts, even sacred texts, with a critical eye.
Right.
We need to appreciate their historical context, but we also need to think about, how those messages apply to our complex world today.
I agree. It's a delicate balance, respecting the tradition, but also being willing to engage with it critically and think about how to apply these teachings in meaningful ways to our own lives.
Yeah, for sure. It's fascinating how, even within a community as devoted as the early Christians, there were still these social complexities.
Hmm.
And it's not just some like ancient history lesson, It seems like these issues of social hierarchy and potential exclusion, they're sadly still around today.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's what makes, studying these texts so relevant. They challenge us to examine our own communities, our own systems,
Right.
to see, I guess, if we're truly living up to those ideals of, justice and compassion.
This idea of justice seems to be like woven throughout this whole sermon.
Yeah.
It's not just about being charitable. It's about, actively working to right wrongs, to protect the vulnerable.
Exactly. It pushes us to think, I guess, beyond just like individual acts of kindness. Are there ways in which our society, even unintentionally, disadvantages certain groups, like, widows, the elderly, those struggling financially?
That's a good point. Yeah. Are we paying enough attention to like the systems and the structures that can, well, perpetuate inequality, even if we don't mean for them to?
Right.
It makes you realize how important it is to, be aware of those potential biases,
Uh-huh.
to advocate for those who, I guess, might not have the resources to advocate for themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. It all ties back to what we were discussing earlier about true faith being demonstrated through action. It's not enough to just, hold beliefs. We need to actually live them out,
Yeah.
especially in how we treat those who are most vulnerable.
Like that quote from James, true religion is measured by how you care for those in need.
Yeah, a good one.
It makes you wonder, are we putting those values into practice, not just in our own lives, but, in our communities and the wider world?
Yeah, it's a powerful challenge. It's not just about individual responsibility either. This sermon is deeply rooted in, I guess, a communal context.
So it's also about recognizing the role of, like, community and shared responsibility.
Exactly.
That caring for widows, and by extension, all vulnerable people, is something we do together.
Precisely. It's the idea that caring for widows is, something that happens within a network of support. A society that truly values justice and compassion, well, they make sure that that safety net exists.
That makes sense, but it also feels a bit daunting.
Yeah.
Like, where do we even begin to apply these principles to our own lives,
Yeah.
in a world that can often feel so overwhelming?
It's easy to feel that way. Like, what can one person do? But remember that quote from Isaiah, learn to do right, seek justice.
Right.
It starts with education, becoming aware of the challenges people face, the systems that contribute to inequality.
So it's like a two-pronged approach: awareness and action.
Exactly. It's not enough to just, feel bad. We need to do something. And the good news is, even small actions can make a difference. Volunteering, donating to organizations that, support widows and other vulnerable people, advocating for better policies, speaking out against injustice. These all contribute to, building a more just world. And even just, offering a listening ear to someone who's struggling, that can be incredibly powerful.
Like a ripple effect almost. Each act of kindness can kind of inspire others and then those ripples spread far and wide.
Exactly. And that's how we create lasting change. One step, one voice, one act of compassion at a time.
This has been an incredibly insightful deep dive.
Yeah, I agree.
It's amazing how these, I guess, ancient texts can still speak to us so powerfully. You've given us a lot to think about. So what are some key takeaways that you think our listeners should walk away with, from exploring this sermon's message?
Yeah, it's been really eye-opening, to explore all these ideas about widows, how they were seen, how they were treated in biblical times.
The sermon really, I don't know, kind of dives into all those complexities and the challenges, and it makes you realize these issues are still relevant today.
You're absolutely right. It's not just, a history lesson. It's really a call to action for all of us, to look at our own communities and see how we can do better, how we can support those who are often, well, I guess, overlooked.
Yeah, one thing that really, I don't know, kind of stuck with me was this idea of the widow of honor, which we talked about a little earlier. It's just, a fascinating concept. It challenges our assumptions about, well, I guess, about what it means to be vulnerable, really.
Yeah. It's a great example of how this sermon kind of paints this, I guess, multifaceted picture of widows, On the one hand, they're vulnerable. Yes, absolutely.
Right.
But they're also strong. They're resilient figures.
Right.
Worthy of respect.
Like that widow of honor, she demonstrates that strength. But it also reminds us that, not all widows are the same. They have different needs. They have different strengths.
Yeah.
Different stories. That's such a crucial reminder, I think, for us today. It's so easy to fall into stereotypes, or to make assumptions about people just based on their circumstances. And this sermon is kind of challenging us, I think, to approach each person as an individual.
Yeah.
With empathy.
Yeah.
With, a willingness to understand their unique journey.
Absolutely. And it pushes us to go beyond, I guess, just providing material assistance,
Right.
True care, it involves, fostering genuine connection, recognizing that inherent dignity, the worth of every person, regardless of their social standing, their economic situation.
I think it's powerful how the sermon connects, these ancient teachings to our lives today. So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thought that you would want to leave our listener with? What's the most important takeaway, from all of this?
I think, for me, it's this. The call to care for widows, as it's presented in this sermon, it's not just some, ancient mandate.
Right.
It's a timeless invitation,
Yeah.
An invitation to practice compassion, to seek justice, and to build a world where everyone can flourish.
Beautifully said. I think that's the perfect note to end on. It's been a fascinating exploration of biblical perspectives on widows. But even more importantly, it's been, a call to action, a reminder that we all have a role to play in creating, well, I guess, a more just and compassionate world. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.